Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Theresa Miller has 30 years' experience as a journalist, media advisor, presenter and corporate trainer. Theresa coaches people from all industries to confidently share their expertise and experience with a wider audience. As a television journalist, Theresa has worked as a reporter, producer and presenter in Britain, Switzerland and Australia, and written for The Australian, The Medical Republic and The New Daily. Theresa is the author of 2 other books, Making Babies, Personal IVF Stories, and a novel, The Spin Doctor's Wife. Today I'm talking to Theresa Miller about her latest book, Speak Up, How to Be a Confident Presenter and Media Spokesperson. Theresa Miller, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this opportunity.
Demand for public speaking is bigger than ever, in the workplace and beyond it. TED Talks, writers' festivals, corporate events, information nights and festivals. How do you account for this rise in demand, and what do people want from it?
That's a good question. You are right that the popularity of writers and talk festivals, if you like, is bigger than ever. You know, Sydney has a very big one, so does Melbourne, but there are also in the regional areas. We're from Bendigo and Bellingen, even Manly, a suburb of Sydney, has its own Writers' Festival, and people are flocking to these events. Even when the Adelaide Writers' Festival was cancelled recently, in its place, in its vacuum, the literary community got together and also put together a temporary one-off event, which is sold out. So there is a hunger out there, I think, for people to try and process the craziness of the world at the moment. People want to seek out experts, someone who's written a book about it, someone who is a subject matter expert, perhaps ask them questions, be surrounded by other like-minded people, because the trust in media, in social media influencers, in sometimes ill-informed media commentators, and the disturbing rise of, say, AI fakes, as in, fake videos, is making people distrust the media even more. So we want to see people in the flesh, experts, share their expertise, share their first-hand experiences, and often give solutions to some of the pressing problems that we have.
Let's talk about one of the problems, and one of the most recent and obvious ones is COVID-19, or within the last decade, and the experience that you quote in your book of Associate Professor Deborah Cromand. Her expertise is in epidemiology. At that time, credible, informed and reliable expertise on the subject was in high demand by the media. Deborah regarded herself as a serious academic and not a media spokesperson, believing that her work in epidemiology should speak for itself. Why was she so hesitant to speak up, and what changed her mind?
I do a lot of work with academics, helping to media train them. And often they are very reluctant when a journalist rings with an inquiry and wanting a comment, because they don't trust the media. They don't know what the media will do with their answers, and they're unsure of how the whole platform works. So they say, oh no, thank you, I'm a serious academic, I'll go back to my lab, thanks very much. And then the media march on and journalists will seek out other so-called experts, but sometimes they're not well informed. And so Deborah Cromer battered away a whole lot of inquiries and requests for her expertise when we were in the beginning of COVID, and everyone was clamoring for an expert to make sense of this crazy time we were in, this uncertain time. So she said no, journalists went away, and then Deborah was really shocked and a little gobsmacked to hear some very ill-informed commentary in the media that really didn't represent what was going on. And then she realized actually she had a responsibility as one of the few people, as an epidemiologist, who could actually allay people's fears and explain simply and logically what was going on and what the likely outcome would be. And that's when she sought out the communications department at UNSW and said, okay, I want to do this. let's line up some interviews with credible journalists, and I think I need media training. I do this with all the academics. We go through, okay, what's your objective? What do you want people to understand from your information? You can't give them your 20 years of your PhD in your studies. You've got to pick your battles and be succinct. And then you've got to explain it in a clear, logical way. So I recommend a number of different structures. Some of those your listeners may have used if they ever did debating at school or at university. And there are some other techniques for also getting back on track when the journalist not necessarily maliciously leads them off track, but because they don't know what they don't know, they ask irrelevant questions. And then it's up to the subject matter expert to bring them back on track. So we practice those on camera with Deborah and all the other academics and experts I work with. And then I play it back and say, okay, this is what you did well, and this is how you could do it better next time. And so we keep practicing. I keep giving them different techniques about their body language, their delivery, their structure. You know, it's rehearsed, it's polished, and it gets cut through.
You write about media training as having the potential to level out the playing field.
I was a TV journalist for a long time myself, and I didn't realize it at the time, but the journalist, especially TV journalists arriving on the scene with a camera and a microphone, they can be intimidating, and they have all the tricks up their sleeve because they know what they want from the story. But for someone who's never been interviewed before, it can be really intimidating and baffling. And sometimes they're so nervous that their prefrontal cortex shuts down and they can barely remember their own names. So they don't give themselves the best possible platform to explain clearly, logically, and succinctly what they know really well. And journalists are often after these little sound bites, especially for a pre-recorded interview. If you were interviewed for the Channel 9 News tonight, you'd be part of a 1 minute 10 story, and your soundbite might be only 8 seconds. So that's not much. That's 25 words or fewer. So how do you give them a soundbite that is unlikely to be cut up and unlikely to be misconstrued? That is an art in itself, and it depends whether you're being interviewed live or you're being interviewed in a pre-recorded interview, and whether you're being interviewed for TV or for radio, long form, or for a feature article, you need to understand what those journalists want in order to give them what they want, and then to also further your own cause. Because it looks like two people are just having a normal conversation, the journalist and you just having a chat, but it's actually not what's going on. The journalist is there to get quotes and grabs and sound bites, and you ideally are there to deliver key messages for the organisation or the cause or your research or whatever it is that you're passionate about and wanting to share with the audience.
So you're saying that the onus is on the academic or expert to not only communicate what they know, but to also understand what the journalist or the audience might be looking for.
Yeah, it is. And look, I can understand why for that reason, why a lot of academics decline requests for interviews. But I think once you understand what a journalist is looking for in a story, you can use it to your advantage, because the journalist needs you almost more than you need them. Because these days, when academics, and not just academics, I do a lot of work with heads of non-for-profit organisations and all sorts of organisations, really. Visibility is key to what they do. So if you're trying to get investors in your company, in your startup, or you want collaborators, or you want to get a grant, then it helps that you can explain to that person what the benefit is to them. And in that way, they're more likely to come on board. But if you just bang on about the minutiae of your work, which you might find fascinating, people's eyes will just glaze over. And then they'll move on to the next person. It's cruel, but it's true. And I really feel for those people who are extraordinarily good at their work and they have solutions to some very pressing problems, but because they're not good speakers, we don't hear them or see them in mainstream media. And I must say, I'm heartened when I speak to experts. They have solutions to some incredible problems. I was interviewing the in-house legal for Youth and Family Services up in Queensland. And, they've got a problem in that part of the world where she's based with a lot of youth crime. And so the government's cracking down and bringing in some draconian laws to jail children younger and younger age. And we know that actually doesn't work, and it costs a lot of money to jail kids. But this very experienced lawyer of an Indigenous background herself said, we've got this mentoring program. We work with these young kids. We work with them for a year, and it costs a tenth of what it costs to jail a child. And it has like an 80% success rate. So it's a no-brainer. So these are things I hear every day, and I get so frustrated because I think, wow, why don't the powers that be listen to these experts and actually take their advice rather than listening to some media commentator with an agenda or some political opponent with an agenda and not actually having the facts at hand. And I really want to see people who know what they're talking about stepping up to the microphone and speaking up, because in that way we can combat misinformation and we can give people real, credible information, and we can solve a lot of problems. We need hope in this time.
We're inundated by information. Fact, fiction, alternative facts, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, even outright lies. They're all out there vying for our attention and sometimes our vote. In your book, you refer to the term hierarchy of information, coined by digital strategist Erin Swan. But how can good, reliable information find and maintain its proper place in this so-called hierarchy?
In an ideal world, the real facts would float to the top and the dross would sink to the bottom, but it seems like the world's flipped upside down at the moment. I think it's up to us as consumers of news to seek out information from reliable sources. And in the book, I do quote Erin Swan, who wrote an article. She was living in Queensland at the time and waiting for a cyclone to approach. She said her phone was inundated with all sorts of misinformation, people saying, oh, don't worry, it's not coming. The cyclone's not coming. It's a media beat up. Don't worry. And then others were saying, oh my God, it's going to be even worse than imaginable. And people had made fake videos, drawing on videos from even overseas footage of other, tsunamis and all sorts of terrible weather events. It wasn't true. And so when Southeast Queensland was deciding whether or not to shut their airport, they needed to go to the Bureau of Meteorology for that, not just people's opinions on whether, this was a serious weather event. And that's where it's actually quite dangerous. We can laugh about some of the other misinformation, but when bad agents are peddling misinformation because they have an agenda, and often a malicious agenda, that's when we've really got to be on our toes and we've got to be vigilant. And in some countries, they take media literacy very seriously. Those countries that border Russia, where their elections are flooded with misinformation, they teach media literacy at a very early age in schools so that even school kids can tell what is real and what's not. And I feel hopeful. I mean, honestly, sometimes my daughters, who are, Gen Zs, they are more likely to look at something that I've forwarded them from Instagram and they say, oh, Mum, that's fake. And I go, wow, how did you know that? And they go, well, and they know because they've spent hours and hours on social media. But I find that alarming, that it is getting harder and harder to determine what is fake and what is real. And only last week, the ABC's finance reporter and presenter Alan Kohler was the subject, if you like, of AI fakery. Someone posted on what looked like an ABC website an article with images in which he was supposedly having a debate about finance with the head of the Commonwealth Bank, Matt Comyn. And in this fake video, Matt Comyn storms out of the interview, throws down his microphone and goes off in a huff. Now, people were forwarding this to Alan Kohler and saying, is this real? This doesn't seem like wow, this seems weird. And he said, no, it's absolutely not real. And then he came out and said on the ABC's platform, social media is dead. We can't believe anything we see anymore. So I find that really disturbing. I wish I had a magic wand and I could change it. All I can say is we need to be very discerning about where we go to for our information, and to be gracious. And when we're corrected, when someone says, actually, no, that is fake, go, oh, okay. And then do your own research. And I don't mean research, sitting on the loo in your underwear. I mean, going to credible sources, like go to the universities, go to particular organizations, the people who deal with arthritis, the people who deal with credible sources, and see what they have to say.
I'm starting to think that this book is not only about communicators, but the receivers of that information, that communication.
That is, I guess, my pet passion, because I'm really disturbed by the way that the media is developing. But people reading this book can't necessarily fix that. All they can do is make themselves the best possible communicators when they either stand up to give a presentation, or to give a pitch, or to be on a panel or a podcast, or speak to a journalist. And also when they're promoting themselves at work, if they're going for a promotion or they're going for a job interview, often, someone will ask in the job interview, tell me a little bit about yourself. And that seemingly, innocent question sometimes stumps people. They just start parroting their resume. And the interviewers think, well, I've read your resume. I want you to tell me something else. So that's when you have an opportunity to talk about your values and what you stand for. And one of the people I interviewed, Petra Buchanan, who does a lot of mentoring for young people in their careers, says it can be really useful to come up with a one-word descriptor of how you represent yourself. And that could be you're a disruptor, or an innovator, or a communicator, or a problem solver, or a peacemaker, whatever that may be. And it will change depending on your career path and where you are, but also depending on who you're speaking to. And I think that's a really important message, that we need to think we change our message slightly and tailor it to the people we're speaking to the audience. So if you're speaking on Radio National, you're speaking to an older audience, so you can talk about superannuation. But if you're speaking to young people on Triple J, they don't want to hear about superannuation. They want to hear about how to get a job. So you've got to, slightly tailor your information depending on who you're speaking to, and get to know your audience, especially in the workplace. The bosses will want to know, well, what's in it for me? Is this going to make us, give us more profits, make life easier, make life smoother in the workplace? It's not about what you want to tell them. Often it's about what they want to hear. That's going to help you get cut through.
Let's talk for a moment about presentation. And I often find myself, when I'm watching TV, thinking something like that, where the hell did she get that lemon yellow pantsuit? And people are very quick to judge appearances, especially with women presenters, which is where presentation is so important. But things like speaking style, tone, dress, timing, and things that might make your presentation appropriate to the event. What are some of the real basics people miss?
Dress is unfortunately very important. People do judge you. Eye contact, your facial expressions, your gestures, posture, what you're wearing, your use of notes or auto cue, and voice is important. And that could be the pace, the volume, the emphasis on key words, the tone and intonation, and the whole variety of the way you use that will add interest to what you're saying, because we've really lost the power of attention these days, because we're, especially the younger audiences are so used to flicking through 15-second TikTok video that they will soon lose interest if you don't grab people's attention immediately. It is quite unforgiving. But things like wardrobe, yes, you don't want to wear, if you're on a stage, you don't want to wear clothing that makes you fade into the background. If you're wearing red and the background is red, well, you'll just disappear. Give some thought to what you're wearing, be comfortable, but also match what the other presenters are wearing, what the host is wearing, what the audience are wearing. If they're all dressed in suits, then you should. But if they're all in casual, then you might look out of place if you're in a suit or in a very corporate look. But it's about being intentional about what you're wearing. Listeners might remember last year when the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in the White House for the first time. And, his country was being bombed by Russia. And one of the press corps, the first question he was asked was, President Zelensky, why aren't you wearing a suit? Which is gobsmacking in itself. And he rightly so said, I will wear a suit when my country and my countrymen and women are at peace. But until then, I will wear army fatigues to fit in with them. So he's thinking about his audience back home. And I admire him for that. Others said, well, he should have just towed the line, worn a suit, it was being disrespectful. But I think it's about being intentional in what you're wearing, not just throwing anything on and not thinking or caring about it, because taking care with what you wear signals that you take care with your career, with your subject, with your audience. It's a sign of respect, I think. And it is true, unfortunately, that women, are subject to much harsher criticism. We all know that story about Lisa Wilkinson when she was hosting breakfast TV, and she was given lots of flack for what she wore, her shoes, her hair, her makeup, while her co-host, Karl Stefanovic, wore the same suit every day for a year, and barely anyone mentioned it.
Let's go on to talk about inclusion and diversity in the media and elsewhere. These days, there's a much greater representation, but men still dominate that field. So I'm going to put your own question to you. If women make up 51% of the population, why aren't their voices making up at least half the choir?
Yeah, great question. I know it was mine. But it is true that according to the recent Women in Media Gender Scorecard, only 30% of expert sources quoted in news stories are women. And that figure was less than half when it came to quoting experts in sport, motoring, and defence, which is pathetic. And men even dominated as media sources in industries where most of the employees were women, such as retail, health, and education. And it's even worse if you're a young woman and if you're a woman from a diverse ethnic background or you have some sort of disability. Lots of different people aren't sought out for their opinions. They're spoken about, but they're not asked for their opinions on their subject matter interest. So what can we do about that? Well, I think, some sections of the media are making an effort. I know that the ABC does have a mission to have 50-50 when it comes to gender parity, when it comes to seeking out comments and interviews from subject matter experts. But often women don't put up their hand, or they decline the interviews because they feel that they're not confident or they don't have the skills. And I remember one woman, a Sydney-based female lawyer, saying to me that she'd been asked by Breakfast Radio to comment on a case she'd been working on for a very long time, and she was certainly in a good position to talk in depth about this case, but she didn't feel confident to speak on live radio. So instead, one of her younger male colleagues put his hand up and said, oh, I'll do it. And then the next morning she tuned in to radio and heard with horror that he was answering these questions, but actually was covering up huge gaps in his knowledge and then making mistakes. But when he went back to the chambers, he was lauded as a hero. And she thought, wow, that's a good lesson. I really should have stepped up and spoken about that because I know about that subject. All it takes is some preparation. Write yourself some poster notes, especially when you're on radio. You can have the desk like I have here covered in poster notes. That's nothing to be ashamed of. You can't remember everything off by heart. And I do have a story about that where it went terribly wrong for me. I wrote an article years ago for The Australian about being left-handed, and it was kind of a light-hearted article. And the history of being left-handed, how in the old day nuns at school would make you write with your right hand, and the background to it. Anyway, it must have been a slow news day because I had 2 radio stations ring me and say, we'd love to interview you about it. And I thought, great, well, I don't need to prepare because I've written the article. So I was standing in my kitchen supervising my kids' homework and making dinner and speaking on live radio, really setting myself up for failure. And then the host asked me, okay, well, there seems to be a disproportionately high number of left-handed tennis players, working professionally. Who are they? And in that moment, when I realized, oh my God, I'm on live radio, I could not for the life of me remember one single name. I just wanted the ground to open up and me to disappear. And as soon as I got off the phone, I went, oh, Martina Navratilova, McEnroe, Rafael Nadal, there's a bunch of them. That was foolish of me. And I've since learned I could have sat in my office with poster notes all over my desk, like I have now, and prompted my memory. Because even if we know our subject really well, nerves can sometimes get the better of us. And why wouldn't you just back yourself and give yourself the best possible chance to succeed?
Theresa, my final question to you is about platforms. It's one thing to have something to say, but it's another thing to have the platform on which to say it. I recently heard a white woman from Queensland make a comment about Muslims. She has a platform in order to say that. But if you wanted to counter something like that, where are the platforms for people who might have much better experience and much more expertise in that area? How can one create a platform for your voice?
That's a really good question. Yeah, and that can be difficult for people who don't have contacts in the media. But you can put something on LinkedIn, you can put something on your own social media, or you can actually reach out to journalists and you can send a media release, you can send a message and speak to, even ring a chief of staff and say, I'm from this background. I'd really like an opportunity to outline why I don't agree with those comments. And you can bullet point your comments. You don't have to write an essay because, chiefs of staff and radio producers are so busy that if you do send an essay, they're certainly not going to have time to read it. But if you just sent them a few bullet points that make sense, some salient statistics and examples, then you've got more chance of getting cut through. It can be difficult. You can write a blog, you can have your own Substack, platform. It's tricky, but it's worth networking with people and putting your hand up and saying, actually, I am really passionate about this topic. I know about it. I have experience, lived experience or expertise. If ever, to a journalist, because journalists are so time poor that when they think, oh gosh, I really need another point of view on this, they just go to the same spokespeople they always go to, rather than reaching out for fresh perspectives. So give them the opportunity, say, if anything like this comes up again, I am ready, willing and able to speak up.
Theresa Miller, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's been a pleasure to have this opportunity and this platform.
I've been talking to Theresa Miller about her latest book, Speak Up, How to Be a Confident Presenter and Media Spokesperson. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.